Hi, it's Tanya, and today I wanted to talk about some books that I've been reading because over the last year or two, I have been absorbing books and I listened to them through audiobook, and I didn't realize I enjoyed learning until I found the right way of learning that works for me or things that I enjoy. And I've really found that I enjoy listening to books on the way to, on the way from work. I thought it would be fun to share about some of the books that I've read, but warning, there are spoilers here. So if you want to read these books, maybe just look at the pictures and go read them before you watch this. Or if you just want to kind of hear about it, you're welcome to. I will spoil some of it, but I won't tell you every detail about every book. So the things that I wanted to talk about today, I am decided to clump my books into themes. And so this theme would be childhood trauma memoirs. And so I call it childhood trauma memoirs because it's when these authors were children, they went through life scenarios that no one should have to. And to me, they are very traumatic. And so, again, this is also a trigger warning. If you don't enjoy things like that, maybe click off the video and watch something else. But these are some books that I've really enjoyed. So, trigger warning and spoiler warning. So, getting started. The first book that I wanted to talk about is A Stolen Life by Jaycee Dugard. And this book was wild. It was about this girl who was kidnapped, but her kidnapper kept her for years, and he kept her in a shed in his backyard. And so it talks about awful things that he would do to her, but her life just like living in this guy's backyard for years and years, and he would abuse her awfully through this time. But what's wild is his wife, fine with it, she would even hang out with her, and it just talks about how she was able to kind of live through all of this, even when she was going through just awful life scenarios. And so a lot of the themes of these books are resilience and being able to get through these tough scenarios. And I really think any of us can apply these to our lives and learn how can we find ways to be resilient when our lives are just really attacking us. You know, like things are happening back to back. That is a big theme. The next book I wanted to talk about is They Cage the Animals at Night. And this is by Jennings Michael Burch. And it talks about his life growing up. His mom was mentally unhealthy and medically unhealthy. And so she had times where she would send him off to be taken care of when she could not. And in these scenarios, he would go to different homes, meaning he would either go to homes of individuals that would take care of him, or he would go to, like, think of it as like an orphanage basically, but where they house all these kids while their parents can't take care of them. And so some of the scenarios, you know, he had a nice place to stay, but most of the time not so good. And so it goes through when he was in the, we'll call it orphanage locations, how they would treat him, how they would abuse him, how they would just really kind of wreck his life. He really just wanted to be protected and loved, and it just was heartbreaking when he kept being sent back to different locations, and you know, his life just was awful and he was abused, and it was just really sweet. And They Cage the Animals at Night, there's a really cute part in the book that you will know why he named it that, I guess. And so it was just encouraging to see his resilience through all of this that was going on in his life, and his ability to then go back with his family sometimes and, you know, love his mom no matter what he was going through, and love her and his brothers no matter what was going on. And you know, you always want your parents, even if they're making life a little bit harder on you, they're your parents. And I used to work in the child welfare system, and just seeing that it's just really true. You see a lot of kids with childhood trauma, they just want their parents. And that was just a really encouraging book. The next book was wild. It's called The Only Girl in the World, and it's written by Maude Julien. And her book was wild because basically her dad was training her for like into the world experiences, so like putting her through training that the military people go through so that she could like run the world. I don't know exactly what the goal was. He had like some wild beliefs, but his wife, he married her very young, and I think he bought her from someone, and she was even brainwashed that they had to do this training and they had to do this, and it was just like a constant like boom, 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 you gotta do this. And so it was just like child abuse and wild what he would make her do for this training. We have a visitor, so she will be a theme in these because this couch is the dog's couch and they like it. And they say, Mom, don't take the couch from me. But anywho, she's gonna just sit with us for a second. But it was basically end of the world training, and he expected her to become this like wild warrior where she was gonna save them from the end of the world. So for her dad to accept her, she had to do just like these wild things. And it talks about like how she would find a lot of hope in her pets, but her mom was just completely unavailable to her. Like she kind of wanted nothing to do with her, but occasionally they would get along and see eye to eye. She wasn't allowed to leave the house. She had to always stay at the home, and so she didn't really get to go to school. They did their own homeschooling there, and her mom was having to do all of this crazy educational training so that she was basically the perfect person. But it later talked about how she planned to escape and different things like that. So very good book, very bizarre, and I didn't realize that happens in real life. I guess I thought it was only what happens in movies, but this was a memoir, so it was something that really happened. The next book that I read was Educated, and it was by Tara Westover, and it was talking about how their family was just survivalists. They believed that the end of the world, the apocalypse was coming, as well as the FBI was going to try to take over their life. And so it talks about all of her dad's delusions. I believe her dad was bipolar, but an untreated, unmedicated. He wasn't trying to get better and try to manage it, because I'm bipolar. I do manage it. And so that's a conversation we can have in a different video, but he took things to the extreme and didn't want help for it, basically. The family also didn't believe in hospitals or like doctors. Her mom was a midwife, so any babies that were born, she would help take care of it. And in hospitals, they just believed in different herbal remedies and things like that. So they just wouldn't often go to hospitals or ask for help in those ways. And so it was wild because sometimes really bad things would happen and they would just have to kind of deal with it at their house. And so I know there were scenarios where they were almost seriously maimed and they still were like, we'll treat it at home. Mom will get some herbs for that. And so I'm not used to that. I've grown up with the healthcare system all over my life. So it was interesting that also people just don't believe in hospitals and they will take things to the extreme. They also didn't believe in education through like a school setting. They believed in learning what you can at home, but like you don't need to learn from a school because you can learn everything you need from home, and I'm going to teach you the things you need to know. But really, you're just going to work at my junkyard. We'll get all that scrap metal, and like that's how we're going to make money. Or you can go and do these jobs. You don't need an education for that, and you're going to get the best education through me. So I just really thought it was interesting because some of the siblings were like, I want a real education. And so they would have to work really hard on their own to get their own education. And so they would use different books, they would use different materials to be able to get their GED or like pass certain schooling. So it was really encouraging to see that these kids, again, resilience to the extreme. Like their parents believed all of these wild beliefs and they were willing to try to learn both ways of life, and education and like see their parents' point of view. So it was another wild book. The next book I read and my mom had told me about it in the past was The Glass Castle, and it was talking about her life growing up in poverty. And it was because her parents, they were mentally unhealthy in the way that her dad would always medicate through alcohol, and so he would spend all of their money on alcohol, to where like she would even have to steal food to try to survive. And they would live in these like rundown houses where the ceiling would be caving in on them and they were living in it, or like the running water wasn't really a thing, or different things like that. Or they would live in a nice place and then they would let it get run down. It was just like a wild book to see how they could live in this extreme poverty and survive through it. And they were constantly moving, like constantly on the move, because their parents, they needed to live their lives. And her mom was extremely artistic, and she would, want to do that more than she wanted to take care of her kids, because her kids were just almost like a burden to her. And then her dad again would drink most of it. And later in life, when the kids were out of the house, they just lived on the streets. Like they didn't even care about having housing, and they were just fine with living that lifestyle. So it was really interesting that they basically had their kids living through all of that as well. So that was a really wild book, and it talks through all of her life chaos that was going on. So I really enjoyed that book as well, but very traumatic life situations. The next book I read that just like, it makes me smile because it was so wild and wacky. It was called Running with Scissors by Augustine Burroughs. And it was talking about how, again, his mom couldn't really take care of him. And so eventually he went to live with this psychiatrist that his mom would work with sometimes. In his house, just like no rules. He never, there weren't any rules set, so they could do whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted, and for whatever they wanted to do. So I remember there was a part in the movie where they decided that they wanted to be able to see through the ceiling into the upstairs. So they started just like tearing out the ceiling, and the dad was like, you got a project there, I see. And they were able to use all kinds of psychiatrist equipment, like the things that would shock the brain back in the day to like try to fix it. Yeah, they would play with those. All of these just very dangerous situations that the adults just did not care. They were like, oh, great, that's very creative of you, and just like wild what they would get into. So it would be so interesting to see what life would be that way, but I guess you wouldn't know anything different. Again, one of those where he didn't really go to school, and just a really bizarre book. I really recommend it. The next one I read was Jeannette McCurdy's I'm Glad My Mom Died. This one's just extremely popular. I think a lot of people have probably read it, but it just talked about the abuse that she would take from her mom growing up, and she was a child star. So she grew up doing different shows. She was on TV. Eventually she made it to iCarly, and it was her mom vicariously living through her, but her mom would set these standards that were like way too high, and she felt like she had to be on these diets to please her mom, and she would have to like stay small, because if she started to become an adult and look more like a woman, then she, couldn't do these roles that she was really good at. And so she was staying small. So it also talks about her life with OCD, and there was things there that I just thought were like fairly relatable. I have bipolar disorder, so I occasionally get OCD like symptoms. I don't have OCD, so I wouldn't wish OCD on anyone, because I get the occasional symptoms, and that just is rough. So it just talks about her mental health journey and how her life changed when her mom wasn't a part of it. So really recommend that book as well. The next book that I read was A Very Private School by Charles Spencer. He was in the upper class of the English society. And so it was known that the kids would go to boarding school. And like, if you're in the upper class, you send your kids to a private school, and those were boarding schools. And so it was known that people would work there that weren't exactly there for the right reasons. There were a lot of child abuse things that would go on in these private schools. And so it talks about his journey of just feeling completely neglected as his family would just drop him off. But he kind of talks about that his family didn't know any better. Like, that's just what you do. And that's like what the family had done for generations and generations. So, but it would just talk about like the awful abuse that he would go through, and that his headmaster, I think it was Jack porch would straight up abuse the kids, like physically and sexually, and talking about how they had to survive this scenario and they wouldn't tell their family because they felt like they couldn't, kind of thing. And so allegations started coming out later as they like started growing up. So I just have not lived in English society, so I know nothing about it. And just like seeing the way that they live in certain mansions and their lives growing up are just very different. And so it was really interesting to see what life as an 8-year-old boy in an upper class society would look like. Very interesting. It was very not the life that I live, and so I really liked it. Another book I read was called Forager by Michelle Dowd, and this book was wild as well. It was like apocalyptic cult, but you are learning survival skills. Like you have to know how to survive when the world ends and there's no running water, there's nothing like that. And so they would learn all these herbs and like all these plants that they could eat, and it even like kind of gives you recipes of like ways that you could eat these things. But she says, you know, only do it if you're with a survivalist, or like, you know, you don't do it on your own. Like don't take her things, just like be careful and don't just go up and eat a nut that you find or something, because it could kill you. So it was talking about the right ways to eat those kinds of things. And it was her grandfather ran this cult. It was a cult, and he was supposed to live forever. And it's just like this apocalyptic training. And again, like live off the land. You don't really go to school. And she had some medical problems. So if you have medical problems, you're disappointing the family because it's God saying you're a sinner and you messed up. So it was really interesting seeing how her family would almost cut her out of their lives because they were so disappointed just because she had medical conditions that she couldn't control. And so it was eventually how she like was able to leave the cult and live life. It was just really interesting because I've barely gone camping without a camper, and it was talking about life like living off the land. And she did have like different places to stay, but it was just wild, and I don't live like that. Again, I think I like the books where I see all this resilience through all these life situations that I'm not in, or sometimes where I can see like part of my life kind of through them. So that one was quite interesting. The last book I'm going to talk about today is A Child Called It, and this one was a doozy. I would say if you are very sensitive to child abuse type things, I wouldn't read the book. It goes through like the most graphic of the books of like child abuse that was going on, because his mother just over time started abusing him just really, really bad. Like even putting him in rooms with chemicals that could kill him, and he would cough up blood. I won't get too technical here. If you're interested, you can read it, but it just talked about how he was surviving just life, miserable life at home, and all the stuff that his mom would do. And he had other siblings. They wouldn't really get it, only him. So I would say, again, that was the strongest worded abuse, where he shared quite a lot. So the most brutal, I would say, in like being a reader and kind of hearing all of that, it was really sad to hear. So all of these books, again, I don't enjoy them because they are being abused, because that is bad. I don't approve of the way that these parents are parenting these kids. Like it's a lot of them are just like not doing great, and it's just an educational mishap where their parents just need to learn more mental health or different things that they need to seek help. Hey, editing Tanya here. I just wanted to remind you that if you or someone you know are struggling with child abuse or neglect, please call 911 or your local child welfare hotline. Even if you suspect abuse, please call. It's the child welfare system's job to do the investigating. You don't have to do that. So the Indiana hotline number is 1-800-800-5556. So feel free to give them a call if you have any of those kinds of suspected abuse. Thanks. My tip of the day, I have trouble reading a book. I really struggle to sit down and read. So I listen to them. So you could always listen to a book. My library has books that I can just listen to for free. So that's a way to listen to them. Or you can buy the books because these authors have spent a lot of time and resources to write them and they've been through a lot. So anyway, that being said, I hope you have a wonderful day. Don't talk to strangers unless they give you candy. And I'll see you next time. Bye!